Yes, on the question of India and China, there is this preconception that these are large countries, but with really no consumer base. Well, let me disabuse you of that notion. The Indian middle class is 300 million strong. It is adding between 5 and 6 million mobile phones every month. So the notion that there's no consumption in these countries is, somewhat misguided. In fact, what is interesting about Indian growth, which has been going on at 8% a year for the past 4 years, is that it is largely internally driven as opposed to Chinese growth, which is export driven, which makes it in some ways safer. India is less at the mercy of foreign markets than China is. These are growing markets, these are not mature markets, and they are growing at much faster rates than those in the north. Overall, of course, the product of the United States, of Western Europe is much larger. But if we look at the direction in which things are going, what will happen in this century, why some people say this will be the Asian century, it is based on some very hard numbers and some very strong trends. It seems to me, a great mistake to underestimate the enormous potential. The future of the world in this century is in the East. And the last thing we can do in the Caribbean and in Latin America is to ignore that. On the commodity situation, again, the notion that this perhaps is something very fickle, it would be a couple of years and so on. Well, China has been growing at 8% a year for the past 30 years. India has been growing at 6% a year for the past 30 years. This is not something that has happened over the past couple of years. It's going, and you look at the consumption of iron, of copper, of oil, of nickel, of other things in these countries, it's still extremely low in per capita terms. So the trend will be to have, it seems to me, a much stronger demand for commodities going on in these countries. In the case of China, of course, given the strong export component of it, it depends to some degree on export, on demand for its products in the West. But this is less so in the case of India. On the question of the changes in Cuba and what they entail, obviously, we have to understand that the economic situation in Cuba is not an easy one. GDP fell by about a third between 1990 and 1993. You can imagine what that means. A lot of Cubans spent much of the day resolviendo, which means trying to get the basic necessities for daily life. Now, as you can imagine, that is not exactly the most efficient way to run an economy now. So the challenges are enormous. And what I understand is that the changes that are still very small, very gradual, that are being introduced by the government of President Raúl Castro, things like, for example, allowing people full ownership of the homes and being able to pass it on to their heirs, increasing the possibility for small and medium-scale agricultural enterprises, being able to buy mobile phones, being able to buy laptops, things like that. These all seem very small and very minor. But in the end, they can add up to something that is more substantial. I understand the issue is not fully resolved. The way I read it, there's a big debate going on in Cuba right now as to which is the way forward. And it can go in a variety of ways, but we are still not quite sure about that. On the question of Cuba resolving its own problems, there is a difference in the approach that is being taken by the United States and the approach that is being taken by Latin American countries as to which is the way forward on Cuba. The United States insists that unless there is a certain type of change, basically meaning dictated according to Western standards of free press, elections, and that kind of thing, unless that happens, they will not give in on the embargo or anything of the sort. Latin American countries are much more open to work with Cuba in a process of opening up, in a process of democratization, but without imposing these harsh deadlines or these conditions. And it seems to me it is important to keep that in mind. There is a difference there. And we might see in the next year, with the new administration in Washington, it seems to me there is a possibility of an opening and seeing some changes there as well. Thank you.
To my immediate left is Rafael Romeo, who is an economist at the International Monetary Fund and whose work is in this region of the world, the South Central American Division, the Western Hemisphere Department, and he will be giving us a presentation entitled Vacation Over: The Implications for the Caribbean of the Opening of U.S. Caribbean Tourism. This is a topic on which many in Jamaica and across the region have had a debate over many years, because there has been a very strong feeling that the normalization of relations between the United States and Cuba would in fact lead to some rather interesting developments in the area of Caribbean tourism. So we really, Rafael, look forward to your presentation on this subject. It's very relevant, both in the context of this region and given what is going on in terms of Cuba-Caribbean relations and, of course, Cuba-American relations. We also have, as our second panelist, Mauricio Miranda Paranda, who is the head of or the director of the Department of Economics at the Pontificia University, and this is in Cali, Colombia. And Mauricio will be speaking to us about Cuba foreign investment tourism and the problems of international insertion. And again, this should be a topic that will be of extreme interest to this audience. After the presentations, we will have a Q&A session. Without further ado, Mauricio, why don't we start with you? You're up and ready, and we look forward to this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you for Wilson Center and CaPRI for the opportunity to participate in this meeting. I apologize because my presentation will be in Spanish with the kindful help of Jose Perales. Anyway, you can see the slides in English.